From a Valentine's Day shooter slipping away by blending in with fleeing students, to a case where the shooter's parents were convicted and sent to prison too. This is the most notorious school shooters explained. Nikolas Cruz told people he wanted the world to know his name, then he proved how fast a school can turn into a war zone. On Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 2018, the entire trajectory of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School collapsed in minutes. 14 students and 3 staff members were killed. The timeline is what makes it hard to breathe. Not hours, minutes. Classrooms became hiding places. Hallways became traps. By the time the noise stopped, a generation of families had already been split into before and after. Nikolas Cruz was not a mystery to the system around him. Warnings had stacked up long before that afternoon. Alarming behavior, threats, prior removals, missed chances to intervene. After the shooting, investigators would point to security failures that made the damage worse. Doors that should not have been accessible were. Safeguards that existed on paper failed in reality. The question stopped being who did this and became how many points of failure had to line up for it to happen. Then came the moment that still feels unreal. Nikolas Cruz did not die at the scene. He did not barricade himself. He walked out, blended in with fleeing students. He was arrested later, alive, calm, and uninjured. The contrast between what he had just done and how it ended only sharpened the anger. For many people watching, that was the first time the word justice started to feel slippery. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out the evidence and the scale of the violence. Cruz eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of premeditated murder and attempted murder. The sentence was mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge read it plainly. The law closed the case. But the room did not feel closed. Families spoke afterward, some shaking, some furious. For them, a life sentence was not balance. It was paperwork. It did not bring back classrooms, birthdays, or futures that were erased in minutes. The name Nikolas Cruz would live forever in headlines, but the people who lost everything were left with the same question that still divides anyone who watches this case closely. If life without parole still feels like nothing, what does justice even look like? Ethan Crumbley was 15, and the paper trail was screaming before the shots ever happened. In the hours leading up to the attack at Oxford High School, warning signs surfaced so plainly that teachers stopped class and called his parents in. Drawings. Phrases that read like a plea. Fear written down in ink. It was not subtle. It was not buried. It was seen. And then it was left unresolved. Ethan Crumbley went back to class. He was not taken home. The clock kept moving. By the time the hallways filled with panic, 4 students were dead and others were wounded. The violence unfolded fast, but what made it unbearable was how close it sat to intervention. This was not a mystery discovered after the fact. This was a failure that happened in real time. The case did not slow down afterward. Ethan Crumbley was arrested, charged as an adult, and later pleaded guilty to murder and terrorism-related offenses. In court, there was no escape hatch. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. A teenager was permanently removed from the world he had destroyed. For many cases, that would have been the end. It was not the end here. The story detonated again when attention shifted to his parents. Prosecutors argued they had bought the gun, ignored the warnings, and refused to act when the moment demanded it. A manhunt followed when they failed to turn themselves in. Then came the trial, then the verdict. Jennifer and James Crumbley were convicted of involuntary manslaughter, sentenced to prison. The first parents in American history held criminally responsible for their child's school shooting. The courtroom reaction split instantly. Some saw accountability finally catching up to negligence. Others saw a dangerous precedent being born. Ethan Crumbley even spoke at sentencing, insisting his parents were not to blame. The law disagreed. Oxford did not just become a case about a shooter, it became a line in the sand, a warning that responsibility might not stop at the person who pulled the trigger. And it left behind a question that still has no comfortable answer. When warning signs are this loud, who is legally responsible for stopping the next tragedy? Adam Lanza didn't just attack a school, he shattered the country's sense of safety in one morning. On the 14th of December 2012, Sandy Hook Elementary became the place where Americans stopped assuming certain spaces were untouchable. 20 children and 6 adults were killed. The number lands hard. Then the ages land harder. First graders, educators, an entire community forced to absorb loss, measured in backpacks and empty desks. The timeline was brutally short. What took minutes to unfold would stretch into years of grief. Families were given moments they would replay forever, while the rest of the country struggled to process how something so fast could leave something so permanent behind. There was no long standoff. No dramatic capture. The violence ended almost as quickly as it began, leaving silence where certainty used to live. In the immediate aftermath, Sandy Hook became a symbol. Vigils filled town greens. Names were read aloud. Promises were made. But as the weeks turned into years, the pain did not fade. It mutated. Parents who had lost everything found themselves targeted by strangers who claimed the tragedy was staged. Conspiracy theories spread faster than facts. Grieving families were harassed, threatened, and forced into courtrooms they never asked to enter. That second wave of damage became its own horror story. Lawsuits followed, public debates turned toxic, media coverage fractured into sides. For some families, the fight to protect their children's memory became as exhausting as the grief itself. The loss did not stay confined to Newtown. It echoed into schools across the country, into drills, locked doors, and a constant low-level fear that never fully goes away. Adam Lanza's name faded from daily headlines, but the impact of what happened did not. Sandy Hook is still invoked whenever the conversation turns to safety, responsibility, and the limits of prevention. It is a case people think they understand until they are reminded of what came after the funerals. More than a decade later, the anger still ignites instantly. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the wounds never closed, and it leaves a question that refuses to settle no matter how much time passes. Why does this case still bring out the ugliest behavior in people years after the lives were lost? Seung-Hui Cho turned a college campus into the deadliest school shooting in modern U.S. history by victim count. On the 16th of April 2007, Virginia Tech woke up like any other Monday. Classes were scheduled, students were moving between buildings. Within hours, 32 people would be dead, and the country would be staring at a number that refused to feel real. The scale is what hits first. 32 lives lost on a single campus in one morning. But the timeline is what keeps people locked in. This was not one continuous event. There was a break. Time passed. Decisions were made. Alerts were debated. Information moved slowly through channels that were not built for speed. The gap between what was happening and what people knew became deadly. Seung-Hui Cho had been on the radar long before that day. Concerns had been raised. Reports had been filed. Encounters with campus authorities had already happened. None of it connected fast enough. After the first violence, the campus was not fully locked down. Messages were delayed. Students kept going to class. That delay became the central wound of the case. Inside the chaos, there were moments that still cut through the noise. Professors who blocked doors. Students who helped others escape. Split-second decisions that saved lives without ever making headlines. These moments sit in sharp contrast to the failures around them. Courage moved faster than systems ever did. When it was over, the questions arrived immediately. Investigations dissected timelines and communication breakdowns. Policies were rewritten. Alert systems across the country were redesigned because of what happened at Virginia Tech. The case became a reference point for every conversation about campus safety and emergency response. Seung-Hui Cho did not survive the attack. There was no trial, no sentencing, no courtroom ending to absorb the anger. Instead, families were left with reports, timelines, and the haunting possibility that faster warnings could have changed everything. That unresolved tension is why the case still feels active years later. Virginia Tech is remembered not just for the number, but for the pause between moments that mattered. The silence before alerts went out, the minutes that slipped away. And it leaves behind a question that still sparks argument every time another warning system fails. When institutions hesitate and people die, who is legally responsible for the time that was lost? Audrey Hale left behind years of writing, and the fight over whether the public should ever see it is still tearing people apart. On the 27th of March 2023, 6 people were killed at the Covenant School in Nashville. 3 were children, 3 were adults. The number is clear and brutal. What followed has refused to settle into silence. The attack itself ended quickly, the aftermath did not. Almost immediately, attention shifted away from the scene and toward what Audrey Hale left behind. Journals. Notes. Writings collected during the investigation. Authorities confirmed their existence, and that confirmation alone was enough to ignite a national argument, not about what happened, but about what should happen next. For some, releasing the writings is framed as transparency. They argue the public deserves to understand how these tragedies form, how warning signs emerge, how prevention might work. For others, the idea feels dangerous. They warn that releasing such material risks turning mass violence into a script, rewarding the very notoriety these attackers often chase. Families of victims have been vocal, calling for restraint, privacy, and an end to what feels like endless re-examination. Audrey Hale became less a person and more a symbol in that debate, not a character study, but an example of a modern pattern where attention lingers long after the violence stops. Each update, each court filing, each public records request pulls the case back into the spotlight. The school community moves forward while the country keeps circling the same unresolved question. The investigation officially closed, but the controversy did not. Courts weighed public records laws against harm. Officials hesitated. Advocates on both sides dug in. The case resurfaced again and again, not because of new victims, but because of the paper left behind. The Covenant School shooting now lives in a different space than most cases. It is no longer only about what happened inside the building. It is about what responsibility the public carries afterward. About whether understanding crosses into amplification. About who gets to decide what is too dangerous to release and what is too important to hide. Audrey Hale's actions ended lives in minutes, but the argument that followed has stretched on for years, and it leaves behind a question that still splits audiences every time the case reappears. Should these materials ever be released? Yes or no? And who gets to make that call? Dimitrios Pagourtzis is the school shooting case where families are still trapped in limbo year after year because the trial still cannot happen. On the 18th of May 2018, Santa Fe High School in Texas lost 8 students and 2 teachers. 10 lives. The number is clear. What followed has been anything but. The case froze almost immediately. Dimitrios Pagourtzis was arrested and charged with capital murder, but the courtroom never moved forward. Doctors found him incompetent to stand trial. That determination paused everything. No jury, no verdict, no sentencing. Families were told to wait. Waiting became the story. Over and over, Pagourtzis was sent to a state hospital for treatment. Over and over, evaluations came back with the same conclusion. Still incompetent, still unable to proceed. Each update reopened wounds. Each delay reset expectations. Years passed, with no criminal trial in sight, turning justice into an abstract concept instead of a destination. The frustration is what makes Santa Fe different. In most cases, outrage peaks at sentencing. Here, it lingers without release. Parents sit in courtrooms only to hear that nothing will happen again. The process repeats. Hospitalization, review, recommitment. The cycle feels endless. While the criminal case stayed frozen, other consequences moved ahead. Civil lawsuits pushed forward against institutions and individuals tied to the tragedy. Settlements and rulings acknowledged harm, even as the central criminal question remained unanswered. 2 tracks ran side by side, one moving, one completely stalled. Dimitrios Pagourtzis has remained alive and legally unresolved, a constant presence without a conclusion. For families, that unresolved status is its own punishment. There is no final day in court to prepare for. No sentence to react to, just a case that refuses to end. Santa Fe became a symbol of a system caught between compassion and accountability. The law says someone must be competent to face trial. The families say time keeps passing regardless. Every recommitment feels like another postponement of truth. Years later, the names of the victims are still spoken, but the case itself remains unfinished, not because evidence is missing, but because the legal process cannot move forward. And that leaves behind a question that never stops resurfacing whenever Santa Fe is mentioned. If someone is deemed too incompetent for trial indefinitely, what is the system supposed to do next? Devon Erickson and Alec McKinney met real resistance inside the classroom because students charged them instead of freezing. On the 7th of May 2019, fear did not move in only one direction at STEM School Highlands Ranch. In the middle of chaos, students made a split-second decision that changed the story forever. Devon Erickson and Alec McKinney opened fire inside the school, but the moment that still defines this case is what happened next. Kendrick Castillo stood up. He did not run, he did not hide, he lunged. Other students followed. The room turned into a collision of panic and courage. Kendrick Castillo was killed, but his action disrupted the attack and saved lives. That single choice is why this case is remembered differently. Devon Erickson and Alec McKinney were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. As the case moved through court, the focus shifted from the chaos of the classroom to the consequences that would follow them for decades. The courtroom replaced the hallway. The noise was gone, but the weight remained. Devon Erickson received multiple life sentences with the possibility of parole only after decades behind bars. Alec McKinney was sentenced separately as a juvenile, later resentenced, and will not be eligible for parole until far into adulthood. The legal language sounded clean. Life, decades, parole eligibility. But those words cannot translate what Kendrick Castillo's family lost in seconds. The contrast is what makes this case hit differently. Terror collided with bravery. Youth collided with responsibility. Students were forced into a moment that adults had failed to prevent. Kendrick Castillo became a name spoken with reverence, not because he was supposed to be a hero, but because he chose to act when no one else could. Devon Erickson and Alec McKinney will spend most of their lives defined by that day. Kendrick Castillo will be remembered for a decision that should never have been asked of him. The case leaves behind an argument that refuses to settle whenever it is revisited. When children are the ones who stop the violence, what does that say about the systems meant to protect them? Should we ever expect kids to act like heroes, or is that the ultimate failure of adults? Charles Whitman turned a university landmark into a sniper story broadcast to a nation watching live, and it still feels like the beginning of a grim era. On the 1st of August 1966, the University of Texas Tower became the center of national attention as people across Austin and beyond realized something unthinkable was happening in plain sight. The setting is impossible to separate from the shock, a public campus. A clock tower students walked past every day. The violence unfolded outdoors, visible from blocks away, with bystanders watching from windows, sidewalks, and television screens. By the time it ended, more than a dozen people were dead, with some later deaths tied to wounds from that day, which is why the numbers still vary depending on how they are counted. What did not vary was the feeling that the country was watching a new kind of horror take shape in real time. Law enforcement and civilians responded under conditions few had ever trained for. Officers moved toward danger without a modern playbook. Ordinary people helped the wounded, using whatever cover they could find. The response itself became part of the story, not as spectacle, but as a reflection of how unprepared society was for something like this to happen in public view. As the dust settled, attention shifted to who Charles Whitman was and why this happened. Investigators uncovered a complex picture that included signs of severe mental distress. An autopsy later revealed a brain tumor, which ignited a debate that has never fully resolved. Some pointed to mental health as an explanation, others warned against letting explanations slide into excuse. Responsibility and illness collided in a way that left no clean answer. The University of Texas Tower shooting became a reference point, not just because of what happened, but because of how the country absorbed it and kept moving. Policies evolved slowly. Public conversations flared and faded. The image of a campus under fire lingered, then settled into history. Charles Whitman did not live to face trial. There was no courtroom reckoning to focus the anger. What remained was a question that has followed every mass shooting since. Was this a warning the country ignored, or an event nobody could have learned from at the time? Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold created the blueprint that later shooters studied, and the most terrifying part is that the damage did not stop in 1999. On April 20, Columbine High School became the reference point everything else would be compared to. 13 people were killed. The number is stated quickly because what followed lasted far longer than the attack itself. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold did not just commit a shooting. They reshaped how the country understood school violence. The event unfolded in a suburban high school that looked like thousands of others. The shock came from how ordinary the setting was and how instantly it collapsed. When it ended, the focus did not move on. It hardened. Investigations, media cycles, books, myths. Columbine became a template instead of a tragedy. The legacy is where the real weight sits. Security procedures changed nationwide. Lockdown drills became routine. The names Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were studied, copied, and argued over. Attention shifted in dangerous ways. The perpetrators were dissected endlessly, while survivors carried injuries that never made headlines. One of those survivors was Anne Marie Hochhalter. She was paralyzed by gunfire that day and lived with complications for decades. In 2025, she died from sepsis, tied directly to those injuries. Her death was ruled a homicide linked to the Columbine shooting. 26 years later, the case claimed another life. That fact lands differently than any statistic from 1999. Columbine did not end when the building was cleared. It followed people home. It followed them into adulthood. It followed them into hospitals and courtrooms and quiet moments the public never saw. The ripple effect stretched across generations of students who grew up practicing how to hide instead of how to feel safe. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold became infamous, but the story they left behind is not about notoriety. It is about permanence. Injuries that never healed. Trauma that never aged out. A community that never fully escaped the day it became a symbol. Columbine still resurfaces whenever another shooting happens, not because it was first, but because it changed the script. And with Anne Marie Hochhalter's death, it forced a question that refuses to sit quietly. If a shooting can kill again decades later, what does closure even mean? Salvador Ramos killed 19 children and 2 teachers, and now the outrage is back in court because a responding school officer is on trial for what he did not do. On the 24th of May 2022, Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas became a place the country would not stop arguing about. The loss was immediate and overwhelming. 19 children, 2 teachers, a classroom turned silent while parents waited outside with phones in their hands and hope running out. What turned Uvalde into a national fracture point was not only what happened, but how long it lasted. 77 minutes passed before the classroom was breached. During that time, families called, texted, and listened. Some heard the last moments of their children's lives. Testimony would later describe confusion, hesitation, and a command structure that never fully formed. Time stretched, trust collapsed. Salvador Ramos did not survive the attack. There was no trial for the person who pulled the trigger. Instead, the focus shifted to the response. Reviews named failures. Reports cited nearly 400 responding officers from multiple agencies. The story did not move on because the questions did not stop. Then came the twist that pulled Uvalde back into the courtroom. Criminal charges were filed, not against the shooter, but against a responding school officer. The accusation was not action, but inaction. One officer now faces trial. Another awaits his own legal reckoning. It is a move rarely seen in cases like this, and it cracked the argument wide open. Families filled the courtroom again. Not to hear a sentence, but to relive a delay. Prosecutors described duty. Defense attorneys described confusion. The law was forced to stare directly at a question it has avoided for decades. When does failure to act become a crime? The contradiction is impossible to ignore. Hundreds responded. Only a handful faced charges. Reports acknowledged systemic breakdowns. Yet, accountability has narrowed to just a few names. For some families, this is the beginning of justice. For others, it feels like a symbolic gesture that leaves the bigger failure untouched. Uvalde does not offer closure, it offers a live argument that is still unfolding in real time. The case ends this story not with answers, but with a line drawn in the courtroom sand. If this becomes the first conviction for inaction at a school shooting, where is the line and who else should be on that list?